Hi, good morning everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome back to the webinar series for the joint CMHA Ontario MCYS project working with children and youth with complex mental health needs. This is the 7th out of the 9 workshops available for this series, and the focus today is on the impact of racism on the needs of children and youth with complex mental health issues. I'm Renee Ferguson, and as usual, I'm going to be your moderator for a joint initiative between the Canadian Mental Health Association of Ontario and the Ministry of Children and Youth Services. As part of the ministry's systems transformation, this project focuses on 3 core service areas, so targeted prevention, brief services, and counseling and therapy services. The project is designed to offer some foundation training to direct service providers in Ontario who are working with children and youth with complex mental health needs. And there are 4 pieces to this project. The first is a live inventory comprising of training that's already available in Ontario, and it's housed on the project website. So you can actually go through and check out a number of trainings that are happening in Ontario, and you can also submit. So if there's something that's happening that you want people to know about, you could submit directly to the inventory. The second is, and this is part of the second, a series of webinars. So this is the 7th of the 9. And then a 2-day face-to-face training that actually occurs across the province in 4 areas. So we had one in Thunder Bay, Thunder Bay, Ottawa, and Toronto in 2014. And at the end of this month, January 29th and 30th, we'll have the final 2-day face-to-face training, and the focus is on working with children and youth with complex mental health needs through a trauma lens. And then finally, there's the 6-part online course that will be available at the end of this month, and the focus is on brief service provision. So just a reminder, if you're interested in any of those pieces, you can check out the website, www.complexneeds.ca, and a heads up that we also have the French website, which you can access through www.complexneeds.ca, and you can see the available resources in French as well. So today we're actually really lucky to have 2 very strong presenters with us today, Greg Cross, who's the clinical director at Across Boundaries, and Joanne Boswell, who's the youth case manager with Across Boundaries. We're excited to have them there because Across Boundaries is really an expert when it comes to thinking about the role of racism and how it impacts the lives of the mental health of people, and especially children in this case who are struggling with complex mental health needs. So I will give them a chance to introduce themselves in a little bit. I just want to go through quickly. For those of you who have been with us before, you know this already, but for those of you who are new with us, just the definition of what we actually refer to complex mental health needs. So complex mental health needs for this project are considered children and youth who are experiencing significant, multiple, or rare or persistent mental health challenges that really impact their functioning in most areas of their lives, such as home, school, and the community. So some examples of this are, but not limited to, children and youth who are living with co-occurring disorders, multiple diagnoses, living with disorders that are impacted by social exclusion, which we will speak about today, involvement with the justice system, which we spoke about last semester, and histories of trauma, which really has been weaved throughout the discussions in the webinar series. So these are often children and youth who are high in need of multiple coordinated services and resources, independent of whether or not they actually receive them. And of course, again, for this project, when we refer to youth, we're referring to individuals up until age 29. And both Greg and Joanne really speak about this transitional youth age in their presentation today. And so finally, I guess a bigger question, as soon as I move this slide, there we go. Why are we talking about this? Well, there is a connection between racism and mental health. Understanding the role that racism plays in the lives of children and youth with complex mental health needs is actually one way that we can support and improve and better coordinate the system. children and youth from racialized communities often face biases that actually translate into racism and lead to either limited access or no access to some of the basic necessities of life, for example, housing, education, and healthcare. And again, Joanna and Greg are going to speak to this. And so this can actually aggravate and complicate mental health issues or trigger mental health issues because it exposes children and youth to additional stresses that really kind of move the development of mental health issues. And so you can think about challenges around self-esteem, anxiety, or depression. And of course, even within saying this, there's lots of resilience that's still located in these situations. So based on some of the work of Dr. Ungar and others, we already know that young people with complex mental health needs use up multiple services that are usually poorly coordinated despite the best workers, despite the best efforts of workers. So it's more of a systemic thing. And so understanding the impact of racism on mental health helps to improve access to services for racialized children and youth with complex mental health needs. And it helps to better coordinate services. So essentially, more education leads to better services in the end. So that leads us to just reminding you that you can access the French website or the French content through that as well. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Greg and Joanne. Welcome to you both. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Cross, and I am the Clinical Director for Cross Boundaries. Before I start, I guess I want to just self-disclose and kind of implicate myself. Before you can kind of begin this process, you have to begin to kind of self-reflect and look. So I do want to identify that I am a racialized Black Caribbean male. I do have privilege, and I do hold a position of power. I think it's also very important that when we're doing this type of work, we need to identify some of the privileges we have and how that can impact on the services we provide. So I do want to identify that when I do speak, I am speaking from that experience. I don't see myself as an expert because, again, I'm only telling a story. And I guess I want to see this webinar as us telling the story of the racialized youth, specifically Black youth, and talk about some of those experiences. Before we start now, we can kind of go into the emphasis of examining racism and other oppression. So that's what we're going to be looking at, specifically experienced by racialized youth. Interrogate how current social delivery models are disconnected from racialized youth. We're also going to discover alternative modalities of treatment that are designed to meet the complex and comprehensive need of racialized transitional youth. Before we can get into that, I think the best thing to do is to understand the conceptual and contextual framing of anti-racism and anti-oppression. In terms of conceptual, we're going to be looking at anti-Black racism, anti-racism, anti-oppression, whiteness. And what I mean by whiteness, we're looking at systemic and phenotypical aspects. So systemic is seeing how it's embedded in the system, but also phenotypical, we're looking at skin, right? We're looking at skin color, and we're seeing that within skin color, there's an ascribed power, privilege, and domination that is seen. The racialized communities see that, they understand it. It's good that as professionals we also recognize that within ourselves as well, because that is going to impact on the way we engage in service. The next piece I'm going to be looking at is the contextual political ideologies and stance in terms of neoliberalism, which focuses on free trade and privatization, globalization, which looks at global capital and deregulation, also color blindness, which again, we're going to go into that further, but you're going to recognize that when we deal with racialized population, we don't see color, we see the person. It creates an invisibility, right, where the youth feels like their cultural and racial identity is being erased. So that's kind of some of the concept around color blindness. Post-racialization looks at racial groups, how they're categorized and being treated differently based on differential and unequal treatment. So basically we're looking at differences and how differences create unequal treatment for youth. So that's kind of the conceptual and contextual framework. The next piece is to kind of go into oppression and then kind of defining what is oppression and what does that look like. I think a big part of that is, and again, I have my own notes, so all the information is kind of there, but I'm kind of breaking it down so you can kind of understand. A big part of oppression is we need to look at stereotypes, right? And when we think of stereotype, we think of the ideas and beliefs about a group or of people that's applied, right, to all members of that group, right? So no matter who belongs to that group, we have a stereotypical viewpoint that sees them in a particular way, and it's coming from an idea, right? So in terms of an idea, I'm thinking antecedent. And when you think of antecedent, these are preconceived notions and thoughts that we have, right, about the person that we're dealing with. The next part of oppression is looking at prejudice, right, in regards to attitudes, right? And what this talk looks at is the meaning and prejudgment, right? These are a set of attitudes and beliefs based on stereotypes. So again, it goes back to stereotypes. The next part is discrimination, right? When you look at discrimination, you're thinking of action, right? So when prejudices are acted on, they result in discrimination, right, in terms of how people are treated poorly, in regards to denied access to services, feeling like their rights are being infringed upon, right? So in some way, when you get to this place of discrimination, you're looking at actions, right, how people now see it. Now, when we're looking at the next form of now oppression, we're looking at forms of oppression in regards to exploitation, right? So this is where the social processes and systems now begin to exploit the people based on their needs, based on the lack of resources that they have. They feel like for whatever reason they're not being taken seriously or they're not being respected. So they put themselves in a place where they feel like either their labor is being exploited or they're being put in a situation where they feel like they're being exploited. Next part of that, in terms of the forms of oppression, is marginalization. When you think of marginalization again, you're kind of an underclass, right? A permanent underclass where you're confined to the margins of society, right? So again, I guess the process of feeling like you're a second-class citizen, I guess would kind of include the concept around marginalization. The next form of oppression is powerlessness, right? So you kind of lack any decision-making or power in one's own life, right? To feel like you have any sense of directing your life. So a lot of youth or people in racialized people within this sense of understanding oppression, they feel like they have no sense of power, right, to make decisions. Another part of oppression is cultural imperialism, right? And cultural imperialism is kind of a technical word, but it looks on the dominant group and how it universalizes. So when we talk about universalizes, it's a categorizing of looking at people all the same in terms of Eurocentric values. Growing up in Jamaica, one of the things I've always been taught was like I learned a lot about England. I learned a lot about Prince Charles, Henry VIII. So all the cultural heritage that I've been taught growing up in Jamaica is never about my own people or my own people's struggle. It's always been in terms of from the British system or from the European system. In terms of my own cultural identity and language, we really didn't talk a lot about that. I knew about it, I heard about it, but with regards to in the system, I was being taught in terms of the language of the dominant culture, right? So when we talk about cultural imperialism, that's the piece of cultural imperialism, right? You kind of mimic or universalize your own language to the point where it dismisses another person's sense of identity. The next part of oppression is violence, right? Systemic violence through harassment, ridicule, or intimidation, which only stigmatizes, right? So these are, again, are different forms of oppression, right? So we're looking at exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, violence, we're looking at stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So the next piece is also what is privilege, right? So privilege is a way of looking at advantages that are attached to members of the dominant group, right? This privilege is often identified by those people that have it, right? So the piece of privilege is looking at meritocracy. And again, another highlight word, but meritocracy is very important to understand when you're looking at privilege. It looks at the resources that are attributed exclusively or primarily on the basis of individual merit. Just for an example, if you're looking in terms of on the oppressed or the racialized, we've always been taught that education is the way out, right? Education, get a good education, you'll do well in life. But the statistics are there. A lot of racialized people with high education, internationally trained, are not given the opportunity or equal opportunity to get good jobs. There's income disparity, there's poverty, but they're highly educated, but at the same point, they're still at the lower end of society. So again, these things can also add to someone's sense of depression or low self-esteem, low self-confidence, which can lead to either drug abuse, alcohol abuse, or the deviant behavior, not attributed to the person, but as a result of the unfair treatment or the system itself. It creates a process where the person begins to devalue who they are. So meritocracy is a myth, right? When people are told that, nope, you get a good education, all these privileges are out there for you. People have those merits, but they're still being kind of under the underclass, right? They still feel like they're being marginalized. So it's very important to understand kind of this meritocracy myth and how it's impacted on privilege. Understanding privilege is essential in understanding anti-oppressive practice. Also, in understanding power, we need to also understand privilege as well, right? Because power is also intertwined and interconnected with privileges, right? It's being produced and reproduced through social hierarchy. When we talk about power, power is the ability to get what you want, right? So that's very important to understand that. So many people in the racialized group or youth don't feel like they're getting what they want, right? So again, it goes back to the sense of powerlessness. So it's very important to ensure that they do have a sense of power and autonomy, but it's also very good to understand and recognize your own sense of privilege and how that could also impact on how the counseling relationship or the relationship is understood. Next piece is the looking at anti-oppression. And anti-oppression is just looking at strategies, theories, and action that challenges social and historical built inequalities and injustices. The piece here I guess I really want to highlight is action and challenges, and that's a big thing about anti-oppression. You have to engage in letting people be aware and know that you are involved in change. It's a process that encourages social transformation and change, not just on a system level or a societal level. Those are obviously ultimate, but I think the change has to start within. And I think this is what anti-oppression really focuses on. It does talk about the system and policies and practices, but it really also identifies how do you reproduce or influence that system itself, because systems are made up of individuals, right? We make up these systems, right? Anti-oppression talks about that, but it also talks about how we ourselves oppress, right? And it's very important that we understand that. And again, once we go later, we'll talk about self-reflective, critical self-reflective practice and how that's important in regards to engaging anti-oppression and anti-racism work. Next piece is anti-racism. And again, you'll see the highlighted term, active, consistent process of change. And again, this is where anti-racism goes into it. It looks at eliminating individual, institutional, and systemic racism, looking outside the norm and reflect on unequal treatment based on phenotypical features. So again, I highlight active, consistent, change, reflect, unequal treatment. But these unequal treatment now kind of go further from the system itself, which is where anti-oppression looks at, and now look at phenotypical features. Phenotypical features, like I mentioned before, is looking at skin color. Anytime you hear phenotypical, you think of skin color. So now anti-racism is now beginning to look at race, and how race is now implicated in oppression. Okay. So the next piece now we're going to go into is now just talking about racism and what does kind of racism look like, how do we examine racism. Looking at racism, we look at prejudice, power, domination, exploitation, right, of one group by the dominant or majority group over another, which is the racialized group. Racism asserts that one group is superior, right, and supreme, while the other group is inferior, right, based on race. Individual action or institutional practice that is reinforced by institutional power, which subordinates people because of their color or ethnicity. So pretty much what it's just trying to say is that within the institution itself, there are practices and powers, right, that keep people in a marginalized position based on their color or ethnicity. So it's very important to understand when you look at racism, it's also very subtle, right? These are very subtle forms. There's different, very modern forms of racism. There's 3 different definitions that you need to look at. Modern and symbolic racism, and then we're going to look at adversive racism, right? Modern and symbolic racism is associated with political conservative views, right, that disclaim any political bigotry and holds a strong traditional values in regards to rugged individualism, self-reliance, and hard work. So pretty much when you look at the modern and symbolic racism, you're looking at conservative values, right? So you're kind of saying, well, we're not kind of engaged in bigotry and kind of overt forms of racism, but we kind of hold to very strong traditional values, right? That focus on kind of the individual working hard, kind of being self-reliant, just kind of being diligent, and if you just continue doing that, then everything will be great. So that's kind of the modern symbolic forms of racism. The other one I really want for you guys to really look at is the adversive form of racism, right? And that's pretty much motivated by strong egalitarian values And when you think of egalitarian values, they're thinking of equality for all, right? So the person that is adversive, they're saying, I want equality for all. I'm all about diversity, but there's an undertone into that, right? It looks at anti-minority. There's still anti-minority feelings that are very they're not as conscious. So you're not really aware of it, but there's an undertone that's very covert. So again, the adversive person that looks at this form of racism, again, they focus on egalitarian values. So we're all about equality and equal treatment for all. But there's this undertone of anti-minority feelings, right? That's there, and it's kind of unknown, it's hidden, but it's really important that when self-reflection gets us to begin to recognize that and begin to understand that. So that's kind of some of the forms of racism that I wanted to look at. Now we're going to go into the dynamics of racism. And pretty much when we look at the dynamics of racism, we're looking at it from an external point of view, right? So we look at it from the community and from the society. Initially, we talked about stereotypes, right? So how one group gets generalized and labeled, all right? This kind of generalization and label creates isolation that's experienced by the racialized person within the community. Once they begin to feel this type of label, then they begin to feel victimized by these experiences and situations, and then they begin to feel undervalued or unappreciated. Once these things start happening, remember, this is happening on external, so this is not even going on an internal level. All these things are happening on an external level, right, where they feel undervalued, they feel the social label and isolation, and then it now engages in kind of day-to-day interaction within the system, right, where they feel segregated, and they kind of being put in kind of a feeling of knowing your place. And then this is kind of what the external system makes the racialized person feel like. Then it goes into now the internal pieces now where it now begins to become internalized. This is where internal oppression kind of becomes manifested in negative feelings, altered sense of self-concept, self-esteem, due to exposure to kind of microaggression, which I'll get into further. It becomes personalized to the person, and then they begin to see themselves as kind of deficit, and then this develops in a persona of deficit that leads to pain. And then this pain now again becomes internalized and causes now, as you can see, this is where the mental health issues of anxiety and depression kind of starts. So it's very important that you kind of look at the dynamics, how it starts. It starts outside the person, right? It starts from within the system, within the community. The messages, right? The cultural imperialism, powerlessness, marginalization, right? All these pieces that kind of add from the system, and then all of a sudden the racialized person begins to internalize that, and then it becomes now, they become the problem, right? And I guess it's very important to understand those dynamics. The other piece, again, we're going to go into is racialization, right? And again, when you think of racialization, you're thinking a process where which the group comes to be designated as different. So now it's not just individual now. The group now begins to have a sense where now everybody kind of has the same definition of being deviant, being disturbed, being disordered, right? You look at any situation, I mean, growing up, again, as a racialized male, if anything would happen in the community, if a black youth was involved in a violent crime, all of a sudden everybody in the community is now violent, right? If they're involved in any kind of horrific situation, it doesn't stay on the individual, right? It's seen as, okay, the whole group, the whole community is violent, the whole community is deviant. If black males are engaged in any kind of promiscuous hypersexual behavior, then every black male is engaged in hypersexual, deviant behavior. So these are things, this is where racialization talks about. It goes from just seeing that the individual and dealing with the problem on that level to then it begins to be categorized and universalized to the whole group. And then they now have to be now attributed as ownership and taking responsibility for those plights. So that's kind of where kind of racialization goes into. It looks at differential treatment, but again, it's based on race, ethnicity, language, economics, religion, culture, and politics, right? It definitely treats people as second-class citizens, and it reinforces the concept as either kind of who's more or less deserving of service or treatment. One of the pieces, I guess, to combat this kind of racialization is looking at anti-essentialism. Essentialism is a really nice technical word, and again, I like this word because this is the word when I was doing my graduate, I really kind of got enlightened and really enriched by this word because it has such great meaning. When you're essentializing, you see the person as is, and I guess when you're buying a car and you see it as is, like it has all the dents, everything else, and you get it as is. So there's nothing else you see. So it's very stagnant. There's no history. There's no fluidity. Anti-essentialism then looks at multiplicity and fluidity of identity. That means when you're engaging with a youth or someone that you engage with service, You can't just see them as is. That youth is coming with history. They're coming with resilience, with strength, with just a racial struggles. There's so many different things that are there, and if we engage in essentializing, what we're saying is that this youth is disabled, they're disordered. We just see pathological symptoms dissected, right? We just want to dissect and kind of let the problem, and that's it. But we don't. There's a sense of loss of personhood, and I guess anti-essentialism looks at the personhood, right? Who they really are. So it's very important to kind of engage in that when we're looking at racialization. The other important highlight here, and I really put as a highlight, is color blindness and racism. Right? Color blindness will only allow us to recognize overt forms of racism and denies a person of their racial and ethnic experience and identity. This concept is really important for you to get, and I hope if anything today, you really get to understand this color blindness. Again, growing up, I can only talk about my own experience. When I would share in terms of if I felt a teacher was being discriminatory towards me, or if I felt like I wanted to go for the sciences and I was told that, well, that's not for you. Like that you're just going to go and it's not going to make any sense to you. And when I talked about what I felt like, you're discriminating towards me, it was made to feel like it's in my head, right? Greg, I don't see a color. Like I see you as a person. I see you as an individual. And as good as that might sound, and it might feel like you're upholding that person's dignity and self-respect, it really is eliminating the person's experience, as I said, the person's ethnic experience, the person's racial experience, the person has a history, right, is being erased in that moment. So it's very important that we kind of recognize color blindness in our own understanding and when we engage with youth, because so really that's very important to kind of examine that and begin to look at that. The other piece I included here is kind of looking at anti-black racism. And you might see anti-black racism and think, well, how does that have to do with anti-racism and anti-oppression? It's very important. Anti-black racism, anti-oppression, and anti-racism, they're all interconnected, right? There's an intersectionality that looks at, there's a commonality, a common denominator when you look at oppression, right? When you look at oppression, you look at dominance. You look at dominance again from whiteness, right? So you're looking at within that structure, within that strata, right? Groups are being oppressed within that system. That system is dominated by members of the dominant group. And as a result, then this process of oppression and marginalization and powerlessness and exploitation is now felt. The piece of why I put anti-black racism in here is just to really acknowledge that within that dichotomy of understanding, that racialized people it tends to be kind of a black male who's kind of become this kind of this terminology, like you kind of trying to think of the word where we're kind of a rare species, right? So they're becoming rare, and I think as a result of that, I just really want to begin to emphasize and talk about when you're working with a black youth and working with a youth, and I mean I've worked in a system. And a lot of major organization, mental health organization, when you're dealing with a youth from Regent Park or Chechaway or certain areas that are very high risk, these youth are seen as not needing any kind of mental health supports or services. And for whatever reason, they're kind of transitioned into the criminal system, and then from there they go into the justice system, into the jails, into the detention center, and they don't get the treatment that they need. And majority of the time when I've worked in detention centers, you'd look at 80-90% black males. And you kind of wonder, when I go into treatment facilities, it's not the same, right? You tend to see either Caucasian or Anglo-Saxon. So it's really I kind of did my own analysis years ago when I engaged them. I'm thinking, okay, how is it that, we see a lot of more black males in the detention centers, but you don't see many in treatment. And again, it goes to this process of demonization, right, where they're seen as not deserving or incapable of treatment. Right, so this is why I kind of included this anti-black racism thought. So when you look at anti-black racism, again, you're looking at racial prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination as directed towards people of African descent. them at the bottom of society and as primary targets of racism. Anti-Black racism emphasizes resistance. Okay, it emphasizes resistance, right, of Black people and allies against dominant systems of power, exclusion, marginalization, and oppression. Their resistive struggles and actions are towards equitable treatment, inclusion, and social justice. The big piece with anti-Black racism is also to emphasize resistance, right, and looking at allies. Within this struggle, we're going to need allies, right? With the racialized people, youth, we don't have a position of power. So if you're white, if you're Anglo-Saxon, and you have power and privilege, you're a therapist, you're a counselor, it's very important that you work as allies together, because I think the only way to kind of overthrow the system and to bring this sense of equitable treatment, inclusion, and social justice is if we do it together. And I think that's one of the things anti-Black racism emphasizes and stresses in this need for ally, but also it looks at resistance. You might see a racialized youth or a Black youth that might be resistant, and again, you have to look at it. Am I pathologizing that? Am I looking at it as he's being difficult or he's hard to serve? Right? We need to really examine what is resistant, because he could be resistant as a way to uphold his sense of dignity, worth, and self-respect, right? And also he's trying to hold on to a part of his personhood. And that might be coming out in this sense of insurrection. But I think it's to understand where is the root cause of that insurrection and understanding the history and meaning behind that. The other piece I want to start getting to is the piece that I really enjoy is racial migration or microaggression. Racial microaggression have been described as subtle insults, verbal or nonverbal or visual, directed towards people of color, often automatically or unconsciously. Microaggression seems to appear in three forms. We'll look at it in micro-assault, micro-insult, and micro-invalidation, right? The other piece that I really want to get into is also, just on a side note, is micro-inequities. And when you look at that, you're just looking at inequity means every person gets the same quality of outcome. But this is also described as patterns of being overlooked, under-respected, and devalued because of one's race or gender. So it's good to kind of understand what that terminology means as well. We're going to define kind of racial microaggression. When you look at micro-insult, it's an explicit racial categorized by verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt or intent the victim through name-calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory action. So when you look at micro-assault, this is pretty much overt forms of racism. So when micro-assaults, again, it's overt, you'll see it. You'll either call a person either colored or kind of a native Indian or Oriental. Like you'll use very discriminatory word when you're looking at micro-assault. Micro-insult also looks at communication that conveys rudeness, insensitivity, and demeaning of a person's racial heritage and identity. Micro-invalidation, on the other hand, is communication that excludes, negates, or nullifies psychological thoughts, feeling, and experiential reality of the person of color. Right. So that's very, very important to kind of understand when looking at micro-assault, you're kind of looking at explicit, overt forms of racism. So kind of just calling people, the N-word, or, just very insulting, derogatory ways of looking at people. Micro-insult, again, is communication that conveys rudeness, insensitivity, and demeaning of a person's racial heritage or identity. Micro-invalidation, again, is this communication that excludes, negates, and nullifies psychological thoughts, feelings, and experiential realities of a person. Just to kind of show some examples of how this works. So this is a theme. When you look at colorblindness, statements that indicate someone from the dominant group does not want to acknowledge race, right? So that's kind of the theme when we look at colorblindness, right? Kind of we don't want to acknowledge race, we don't want to even kind of recognize it. The microaggression here is when I look at you, I don't see color, right? Canada is a multicultural nation, right? So that's kind of the sense when you see the microaggression and how it works. The message is denying the youth their racial ethnic identity or encouraging them to assimilate or acculturate to the dominant culture. The other piece, the theme of a racialized youth is presumed to be dangerous, a criminal, or deviant on the basis of their race. The microaggression message is someone from the dominant group clutching their purses or checking their wallets as a black person approaches. The message is you are a criminal. I'm going to let Joanne then do her piece.
Hi, everyone. So I will be providing a bit of detail more on what I do as a case manager towards the end of the presentation. But what I would like to do is just discuss with you one of the concepts that I find quite pivotal for my work as a case manager, and that theory is the social determinants of mental health. So technically, the whole realm of social determinants of mental health are what factors within the community, but as well on a policy and procedure level, impacts the individual. As Greg has stated earlier in the presentation, that there is an interconnect between the personal and the political. So meaning that an individual may be perceived as a deficit, but in fact their interactions within the community, but as well the policies and procedures within the education system, within the immigration, as well as work and employment, housing, and the list goes on, does impact the individual, which causes their mental health to either be improved or to decrease. So as a case manager, I always take into consideration what are the determinants that impact their mental health. As a case manager, I would say that important factors that I do consider are culture, as well as the healthy child development. The reason why I would say culture is that, again, we deal with racialized youth. And many times our culture, as well as the subcultures, are forgotten. Racialized youth oftentimes are migrating to Canada, and they've already held on to many of their traditional values, their way of speaking, the way of being, as well as wearing particular clothing that expresses themselves. When migrating to Canada and actually learning a new way of being, they realize that those social norms may not be accepted, or in fact, they are isolated in particular environments. As a result, it causes them to feel quite isolated and have a lack of sense of belonging. So in that situation in itself, you can see how the mental health would be hindered and actually decrease because, again, if they're going into environments where they feel as though they're not understood or they can't be themselves, especially since they've held these traditional values and are so dear to them, many times, again, they will isolate or experience some symptoms related to anxiety, depression, the list goes on. I would also say that healthy child development is necessary to understand around mental health. Reason being is that trauma, particularly around childhood, does impact the mental health in a negative way. Trauma would be around abandonment, it would be neglect, it would be seeing violence within a particular area. And as a result of seeing it and probably not getting the actual good supports needed to discuss that forms of trauma and developing good coping mechanisms, could lead to the child, or as well as the youth, finding ways, and sadly, negative ways of coping with it. So that could include either demonstrating violence, it could mean taking any form of substances, it could mean showing some levels of aggression that would lead to other barriers within their life. So again, social determinants of health is necessary to understand exactly what the individual is experiencing, but as well for goal setting, which I'll discuss later in the presentation. This is actually a diagram that was made through CAMH. And I have already pressed on around how culture is important, but I also want to highlight on the immigration-migration piece. Reason being is that, again, dealing with racialized youth, many times they are using the immigration system. The immigration system is a very lengthy process where there are court hearings as well as documents you need to fill out. You have to be consistent as well. You are connecting with the legal system. With that being said, the insecurities that a youth can experience around this is quite high. Reason being is that many times they're waiting up to 2 to 3 years for a notice to see on whether they are able to stay in Canada. Those insecurities tend to fester, and their ways of dealing with it are quite different. Some may isolate, some may become tearful, some may have anxiety or panic attacks. And being able to be aware of exactly what the immigration process is and how these policies are constantly changing, you can see how it impacts the youth directly. Right? I would say that violence is also something that's very important to understand. In the racialized communities, there's at times violence. Violence is demonstrated in different ways. It's either overt, right, or covert. Either overt would be that there are either actual shootings in the community, and as a result of those shootings, you are losing someone that is quite close and dear to you. That is a form of trauma in itself, and a lot of you do have issues coping with losing someone that's very dear and close to them. Many times the supports that we do provide are to, again, talk about the traumatic experience, develop ways of coping with these experiences, and then moving forward on what goals are they looking for, which is considered mental health recovery. So a quote that I'll like to read to you is, racism can cause mental illness itself, but once you have the illness and are in the system, racism determines access. The course of your experience in mental health, our system will be directed by race, gender, sex. You're more likely to get there and to get stuck. I just want to note, and I found this quote to be quite powerful, reason being is that many times racism is not considered a form of trauma. And it's dismayed, and the reason why it's so important to understand the interlink is that trauma, the symptoms related to it, are often isolation. It's anxiety attacks. It's, again, displaying some form of aggression, which some people may see as ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. And as a result, they're placed with these labels. And if they do state a simple experience of probably walking into a store, told that they are probably doing deviant behavior or taking an item that they're obviously not taking, those experiences obviously become traumatic for them. And sadly, if it continues on a regular basis, they may be considered as being paranoid if they expressed it to someone that does not understand these forms of racism. So it's so and highly important that we understand that yes, racism is a form of trauma and there are symptoms related to it. These symptoms as well, we do need to understand that they may not be the mainstream symptoms, that one's environment, what their coping mechanisms are, what their learning styles are, does demonstrate how they will interact with us all. So mental health system in the main Canadian institution, there are various power as well as privilege that's exercised. And our power and privilege is usually through race, class, gender, as well as our sex. I myself, being a female, Black female, having my graduate degree, I am always consistently examining the types of powers and privilege that I hold. Reason being is that I understand that not being aware of those powers and privileges can impact how my youth get service as well, how they connect with me. So in the mental health system as well, I allow the youth to explore exactly what their powers and privileges are. The reason being is that even though they may be seen as shunned away in society, they also need to be able to show and demonstrate resilience and get through the system. And that power in itself allows them to get through the system, but as well develop some level of advocacy with their friends as well as families and allies to move forward in social justice. So one thing is to see is that racialized people are socially non-dominant in society. And as a result of being non-dominant means that their access to services within the community will either be limited or decreased altogether. Historically, the mental health system has demonstrated some level of perpetuation or oppression of access to these services. And the reason why I would say that is that if we look at the education system, there are some youth who have, again, shown some form of oppositional defiant disorder, or they have been overdiagnosed. If you really do take a lot of consideration to what their environment was, you can see that many times they were either over-disciplined or didn't have enough discipline in their environment, which caused them to probably react in a particular way. They have either been neglected or abandoned, and other factors do come into play. So actually placing a diagnosis on a youth without actually looking at other factors that impact them will most likely cause them to be placed in the system and have no way of coming out unless they become resilient and understand their level of power. So barriers to prevent access to service and Western medical model. I believe that understanding the medical model is something that you need to be in tune with. Reason being is that as a worker, but as well as the racialized youth we work with, they are interacting with the medical model consistently when in the mental health system. Many times the medical model, their assessments, they will demonstrate some level of expertise as well as evaluation on how well the person is doing. So for example, if a Black female enters the hospital, indicates she has some levels of symptoms, right, there's a possibility that the symptoms will be related to her, right, and her issues as not being able to cope with her school, or possibly there could be a factor of the school system having some levels of racism within it, right, which causes her to feel isolated or have a lack of sense of belonging. So with all these factors being considered, I think it's important to understand that these assessments are biased, right? They do hold a particular view, they do hold a certain power and privilege, which many times can either cause the youth to feel either connected or actually pushed away and felt understood. There is a high importance for the holistic approach. The reason being is that the holistic approach understands the interconnecting of the body, mind, and soul. The body, mind, and soul, it usually incorporates either the faith-based community, right, spirituality. It includes different forms and practices of relaxation. And oftentimes that's forgotten again in the medical model, right? What are the traditional healings or forms of being that creates this person to be who they are? So I'm just going to highlight again the important concepts to remember around the medical model is that there is no tangible link between the racism as well as the medical model, meaning that the symptoms, trauma symptoms related to racism at times could be forgotten, right, or not considered enough in order to move forward to assist the client in developing the goals they need to recover on their terms. The experiences are different for each person, but is still considered valid. Sadly, an individual who may be stating to their psychiatrist that they've experienced some level of racism may be dismissed, may be considered paranoid, right? And these experiences obviously will cause the youth to feel as though they cannot connect again with another system because they felt that level of trust, but as well, no one willing to connect with them on a level that they understood. As we reiterated before, the frequency of racial discrimination does impact the individual with mental health, meaning that if a person encounters racial discrimination on a daily basis in comparison to one that experiences it on a weekly basis, their mental health, there will be mental health differences, right? The one that encounters the frequency of racial discrimination will most likely have more symptoms, right, related to a poor mental health situation. So the racial discrimination is demonstrated in not only the school system, but as well the criminal justice system and social work. Symptoms that I thought that would be important for you to remember while connecting with youth, especially the racialized youth, is that the symptoms that they may express to you or inadvertently demonstrate to show that they may be experiencing some levels of racism. One of them may be isolation. So does the youth frequently sleep at their home or somewhere else in their home, right, as a way to cope with their situation? At times they will avoid settings, and sadly the youth will be saying, go to school, right? They'll be stated, always reiterated, please go to school. Many times they don't realize that the youth are avoiding school because, again, that's an area that they don't feel a sense of belonging. And many times the reason being is that they've been humiliated, right, by either a teacher, by students or so forth, and it hasn't been dealt with, right? And as a result, they will use this coping mechanism to survive. They have experienced panic attacks, either having a blackout session or increased heart rate, as well their appetites would decrease. Other symptoms are feelings of emptiness. I have youth that have expressed to me, I don't feel connected to my body. When I look in the mirror, I don't feel as though I know myself. Self-hate would be having high levels of suicidal ideation or actually cutting as a way to say, you know what, I need to find a way to cope with my experiences that are most likely racial oriented. There's a lack of hope for the future, and I thought that this was very important to understand, especially around the policing framework. youth who are in the community and who are frequently connected with the policeinovertly or overtly, so police is in their area, they will have a distrust for the police. If there is a situation where they feel could be reported or would be reported, they would not, just as a way of avoiding the police and not as well being racial profiled. So with situations like this, I think it's highly important to understand that the racism that the youth encounters will most likely cause them to either isolate themselves, have lack of hope for the future, but as well display some level of aggression, right, as a way to state, I'm not happy with my current situation. What I've done is actually provided you with a bit of examples with the education and mental health system. So once you guys do get the time after listening to this webinar, you could review it more in depth. But the important thing to remember is that within the education system as well as other institutions, assessments are used as a way to govern who requires help. The individuals who require help, we do have to realize is that there are many times biased views hidden in those assessments. And those biased views will cause them oftentimes to be segregated, and those segregation will lead to obviously perpetuating isolation within the community. So I'll be reading this scenario out to you. A 16-year-old youth who recently, 24 hours prior, released from a hospital and was suffering from another psychotic episode, was returning to the hospital with his father. Making his way back to the hospital, the son began acting out of control, making it unsafe to operate the motor vehicle. The 15 officers circled the car to create a wall, while several officers approached the youth to engage and remove him from the vehicle. By now, Dad is hysterical and crying loudly, pleading with his son to forgive him and not blame him for what is now happening. At approximately 3:50 p.m., the ambulance finally arrived and they assisted in getting the youth to the hospital. Okay. So we are not able to fully review this in depth, sadly, because we're not in person to do this, but I just want to highlight things that would be important to note. One thing would be to understand the trauma related to having police around, particularly 15 police with 2 individuals, is obviously extraordinary. In addition, the dad expressing his level of disappointment with the situation and pleading to his son to forgive him already shows he has a sense of powerlessness, which already links to the racism as well as the institutionalization of racial profiling that I'm sure the father knows very well, right? Another consideration to also take into point is that with the hospitals, again, there are significant wait times, and as well, there's not as much beds as there are for people who require the help. As a result, it causes that individual to, at times, even though they may require observation, to be released from the hospital because there's not enough space in the hospital. So in a situation like this could have been, right, and could have been diverted if there was probably enough spaces at the hospital. Okay, social factors to consider when working with youth are poverty, housing, and racial profiling. And again, this is all connected with the social determinants of health and understanding that there is a history of racial profiling with youth. And sadly, they're always being connected back to the criminal justice system, right? And linked back to either having a mental health condition or not having one. And there is that lack of treatment to assist them to move forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Joanne. The next piece we're going to go right now on is just talk about stats. We're going to look at race and imprisonment. So in 2011, indigenous people were 4% of Canada's population, made up 21% of the federal prisoners. Africans were 2.5% of the national population and over 9% of the federal prison population. In the period of 2001 to 2011, indigenous federal prison population grew by 37%. Corresponding figure for the African-Canadian was 69%. So again, this just shows in terms of specifically when looking at the indigenous and the African Canadian population, you see a huge increase when it comes to imprisonment and criminalization. Next, we're looking at race, youth, and imprisonment. In 2005, the number of young white males from 12 to 17 years old in the Ontario provincial jails went down by close to 40%. The fall was not the same for the racialized. Africana boys were 5% of their cohort in Ontario in 2011, but made up 24% of the incarcerated youth. And as you can see from the sign, jails don't solve the problem, right? So it's just important just to recognize just how, again, racialization and racism is also impacts on the prison system when it comes to youth and race. The next piece we're going to be looking at is gender and race and imprisonment. In 2011, Indigenous 12 to 17-year-old boys were 2.9 of that segment of Ontario population, but they were 15% of the imprisoned. Indigenous girls were 10 times overrepresented in the Ontario jails. African girls are 2 times overrepresented in the jail as well. So again, we're making a connection between the African, the Indigenous, and seeing just a high increase of the criminalization, demonization of how dealing with the issues that imprison them, right? And kind of the social banishment and social exclusion is kind of what's happening right now. Joanne's going to go into just talking about the stats on youth and involvement in the child welfare system. So she's going to just kind of connect the 2 slides.
So again, because it's just because we have discussed quite a bit in terms of the youth experiences, I just want to highlight, and I won't be able to go into too much detail, that there is a higher proportion of youth, racialized youth, within the child welfare system, right? 38% of the children are in care in Canada are Aboriginal, and that in itself shows, right, that this high proportion, how does this link back to structural discrimination or institutional racism within not only this system, institution, but as well as other institutions in which they interact with? Again, I'm not going to go into the scenario too much, but one thing that I do want to mention is that the questions that we ask, we do have to ensure that it's not racially based on stereotypical views. In this scenario, once you're able to read it, the question of this worker, we see this worker, and it could happen in any setting, not only this setting, asking whether Marie smokes marijuana after she reveals that she's a Rastafarian. You could see that there's a bias there. The reason why there's a bias is that one thing she immediately asked that question once Marie expressed what her faith was, right? And there is that correlation of belief that Rastafarians only smoke marijuana, right? So we do have to be aware that what truth does our assessments hold? Because many times they are the mainstream, and it indicates whether this individual is either sane or insane, whether we can rely on them or not, whether they should be included or excluded. So again, in these assessments, as well as the ones in our workplace, we need to be aware of exactly what our assessments evoke. Okay. Again, with all the assessments, I would say is that we do need to be careful that there may be the underlying Westernized value belief system. And although this Westernized value belief system can be helpful to assist our clients, one thing is that it may take away the faith and cultural traditions, practices, and lifestyles that our community loves, right? Oftentimes, without asking questions or engaging in things that they enjoy, is almost a level of scrutiny, right? It's stating that we don't appreciate that information or it's not something that's valid. So the questions and assessments we use does need to ensure that it's holistic, that it not only asks about traditions, but as well as about our religion, right? Things that we enjoy doing, things that encompass who we are.
Okay. So I'll hit this one pretty quickly as well. I'll try to kind of not talk too fast. Joanne already touched upon a lot of these pieces already. I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the theoretical pieces. When you look at the medical model of disability, you're looking at a reductionist perspective. Reductionist perspective takes three stages. It looks at universal truth as happening all over the world. It looks at a Western biomedicine perspective. It perceives hierarchy of knowledge that elevates the biological and the physical aspect of the human being as the ultimate truth. So when you look at the physical and biological aspect as being the truth, you eliminate race, you eliminate culture, you eliminate systems, you eliminate the personhood, the personality, the identity of who makes that person a human being, the essence of who they are. So again, the reductionist, you reduce the person to just being just a tool, an instrument, right, where there's no meaning. The Western medical knowledge also sees itself as culture and racial free from truth. So just a kind of quick quote from Taylor in 2003, medicine as a culture of no culture. So it's just kind of good to identify that piece. The other piece, let's look at for senior management and senior makers in terms of understanding racism and mental health. Racism can actually cause mental illness itself, but once you have the illness and are in the system, that becomes kind of the determinant that you kind of look at, right? You can begin to feel very stuck and feel like there's kind of no hope, sense of hopelessness and helplessness that kind of is engaged in the process. The piece here that I really want to kind of focus on is kind of when you look at the mental health professional, we must be willing to and be able to assess race-based trauma in their racialized clients. So again, when you're looking at clients, rather than looking kind of from a symptomology or a pathology base, is also to look at how race-based trauma can also be assessed in your interventions and tools. The course of experience in the mental health system will be directed in terms of looking at race, gender. When you kind of engage in that system, people kind of feel like they're either stuck or feel like they're in the system, and then it's kind of a perpetual cycle that they feel like they're being dismissed. So in terms of being overdiagnosed, they kind of create a very stagnant process where they feel like their own social identity is being diminished.
As I've discussed earlier in terms of alternative forms of healing, I did want to just focus on what types of healings are there. There's this spirituality, there's modification, even having that spiritual piece and what they considered shamans who evolve and connect with people who are connected to the spiritual world. These healing traditions are often forgotten in the mainstream, and oftentimes when they are forgotten, they are ostracized when they're brought in. I've observed in various settings that I've worked in the past where an individual would indicate their need to have their pastor come and visit them because they were recently diagnosed with, again, a mental health psychiatric disorder. Sadly, at that time, that patient was shunned and stated, you don't need that right now. There's no circumstance. So it's mindful to be, when we're in any setting, right, to consider exactly what types of spirituality components does the individual hold, faith-based, right? What's their forms of dietary intake? What terms of or herbal treatments do they use, which also is important, especially if they're using any other medications, right, which can impact their body in either positive or negative way. But being aware of all these components helps you with goal setting, but as well being able to finally hear your client's story from where they're at. So there is the need to understand that healing and recovery is addressing the direct link of negative impacts of racism. It's important to name it when necessary, especially through narrative storytelling, to state that, yes, that was racism and validate the youth as well as their families' experiences, because many times diverting from it will make them feel again that they may be considered paranoid or feel as though there's a disbelief and insecurity of who they are. As well, incorporating that holistic approach for the racism piece is important because that spirituality, right, will allow them to heal, especially from the discrimination, any form of discrimination that they have, but as well to move forward for their goal setting. There is the importance of narrative components for working with youth. The reason why I say that, again, back home, which I would say is Jamaica for me, storytelling as well as forms of humor are used as a way of having a conversation. So having a direct method of asking questions, right, continuously and answering it continuously is often awkward. So by being able to have narratives and storytelling and humor, one thing, it eases any form of anxiety of giving the situation, but allows the youth to finally express their feelings of hurt, emotion, any fears that they may have, but as well discuss where they'll like to move forward, particularly after that traumatic experience. I find very, very much enjoyable to finally have that opportunity to talk about their strengths and resilience. Many times the narratives will give in-depth details of how that youth has demonstrated resilience within their situation. And often I use those examples of resilience as a way to assist them, right, to show how they could move forward on the goals that they have chosen. This is a spiritual assessment tool. There are several questions there. But one thing that I would say would be important to use when working with a youth, especially if they find that spirituality is important to them, right, is ask them, are you connected with a religious or spiritual group? And how often do you go? How do you feel when you're in the setting? What does it do for you? And based on those questions, it'll show exactly what's that level of importance for the youth, or just asking them directly, what is that importance, okay? Other times there are other faith-based communities that they connect to, but how involved are they? And being able to see those levels of involvement allows you to see exactly who would be their support systems when goal setting. Healthy spirituality does help with identity development and development overall with the physical, the mental, social, and emotional. I have seen a lot of individuals, especially having conversations with me about their spirituality, evolve so much without medication as a result of being able to finally connect with a faith-based group, which they were shy to do to begin with. So there is that component of being able to understand the mind, body, and soul, which I encompass in my case management process, to ensure that the youth is being able to, again, evolve in their identity of who they want to be, right? But as well understand what that social, emotional, mental connection is. The spiritual regimes that one may use are either regular prayer, they may be journaling, which I always encourage, and if the youth feels comfortable, they could actually discuss it with me during their sessions, right?
Yeah. No, my piece. I'm going to try to go through this. I'm going to probably highlight some very important pieces. The 3-5 model, I kind of studied up on it, really looks at when you're examining a youth or a child within the mental health or any critical knowledge perspective is to look at the impact of separation and loss due to traumatic experiences, and these can also be behavioral and mental health difficulties. I like this quote. Again, too frequently children or youth are viewed as disturbed rather than grieving. So just if you can kind of understand and see that, that helps to we're looking at clarification, integration, and actualization. Clarification in regards to assisting the youth in understanding what has happened in their life. So they've come to you, like I said, a lot of trauma, a lot of history. So trying to understand from their point of view where they're coming from, that's the clarification that you're seeking. The integration is helping the youth to understand that they have multiple membership, right? So their membership is not just in their mental health or in their mental health diagnosis, but it's in their culture, it's in their family, their faith, their belief system, right? So when you're integration, you're looking at their sense of belonging. The other piece is actualization, so helping them to know and visualize their membership and citizenship. So visualizing what it feels like to belong. So actualization, you're actually making it real. In terms of the 5, answering the 5 question, who am I? Looks at identity. What happened to me? Looks at loss. Where I'm going? Looks at attachment. How will I get there? Looks at to look at. So engage the child and youth in the process. So you have to be engaging. Listen to their words when they speak. Be truthful and honest. validate their life and stories, create a safe space for them as they start to do this work. It's never too late to go back in time. And I think this is the piece that really resonates with me. Pain is a part of the process. So it's very important to kind of identify that again when working with you. Next piece is kind of the 6 principles of resilience, and this is kind of the Angar, the 6 principles of good services, which we talked about, so multiple level. But this making sure that the person fit environment, that's when you look at ecological. That's what it talks about. So the individualized planning. It must be coordinated to reduce barriers created by service. So when programming services are being coordinated, it needs to be accessible. And in terms of a strong indicator, families are going to be successful. So there needs to be coordination and accessibility. Emphasis on continuity over a long period of time to ensure seamless delivery of engagement in kind of meaningful service. Allow for a negotiation with service participants to ensure that cultural and contextual relevance is there. Offer a continuum of intervention from least to most intrusive, and treatment needs to be effective based on practice and evidence-based modality. The next steps on recommendation is in terms of just very important to kind of just break in the silence of racism and kind of any form of oppression by having authentic, open dialogue, honest dialogue, dialogue based on strength, resilience, and resistance. Acknowledge and reflect, right, on racism in terms of its impact on the mental health system. Providing ongoing education to both agency, to the client, and also to their community. In regards to answering a very important question, what is mental health and what is racism and its effect on health? So just very important kind of when assessing and working with the clients. In terms of intervention, helping the racialized clients recognize potential barriers of racism and oppression, which is self-determination. Listening, empathizing, validating, and the racialized client's experience. So that's the whole actualization process. And just taking individual organization action and result of to bring about real change that brings equitable, inclusive treatment. So what that is activism and action, right? So you have to be an activist and you also have to engage in action if you want to see true change. The other piece is just understanding power dynamics and its impact on everyday interaction, looking at social location and social identity, looking at and understanding how power can be used to deteriorate and help in kind of the relationship between you and the client. Examining attitudes and belief in terms of looking at how it impacts inclusion or exclusion. So again, that's where you get into critical reflexivity, understanding how you implicate yourself in that. Next piece is just anti-oppression practice. Just again, looking at eradicating social justice perpetuated by social inequalities. Again, critical self-reflection, which I've already shared.
Listening to all of this, one thing that may come to mind is like, what do I do with all of this information, right? So pointers that Greg and I, and again, we're not experts, but suggestions that we could provide you with is that understanding that, and you probably already know that each client's experience is unique. And by understanding that, you take the time necessary for the client to provide their narratives and storytelling to finally understand what their culture, family, history, environment is about, right? By being able to allow the client to talk at their pace, in their terms, on their way, and it'll also allow them to demonstrate, right, how they've shown some level of resilience in their life, or many forms of resilience. And by being as a worker to hold those examples of resilience during hard times, and particularly when goal setting, right, will be quite helpful to allow the youth to build some level of motivation or increase their identifying how justice or terminology, well, stereotyping labels, impacts your client, and going through that process of having the conversation, right, of how this negatively impacts them, and what ways do they want to show resilience in situations like that. As worker, and Greg has already mentioned, but as well as to understand the power dynamics we hold as workers, being able to understand what our social location is, but as well as our privileges, right, when interacting not only with clients, but as well as staff, right, allows us to see ways in which we can encourage levels where youth feel more empowered in their situation, right, and decrease the level of oppression they experience when interacting with other professionals. So thank you so much for listening.
Okay. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Joanne. That was a lot of good, solid information. So originally we had planned to do some breakout groups, but just looking at time, that's probably not the best use of time right now. But what we do want to do is give people a chance to take this in and to ask questions, because we have two experts here who have lots of experience in integrating a lot of the ideas that we've heard today. So I'm going to open up the question box for folks to take a look at. So you'll see on your screen, you should I'll facilitate that. So I see a few people already typing in, so let's see who gets theirs up first. So the first question is, can we have access to the PowerPoint? Of course, as mentioned earlier, all of the material that we make reference to today, and today I think it's really only the PowerPoint, will be up on the website tomorrow. And let's see what other questions people have. Stereotyping or over-scrutinizing that one identity. Can you speak more to the importance of intersectionality? Thanks, Deborah, for that question, and I don't know who wants to take it, Greg or Joanne. Yeah, you can just...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Intersectionality is a huge part of anti-racism, because it's to show that how each one of the forms of oppressions are connected on some level. The only piece why I talk about the other forms of oppression is to look at the severity. Because even within the hierarchy of oppression, there's usually a group as at the bottom, right? And it's good to acknowledge who those groups are. And again, as you can see from the presentation, in terms of the First Nation, indigenous population, and African or Black Caribbean, especially Black males, they tend to be significantly at the bottom in terms of violence, poverty, just in regards to the look how their treatment in the system. So we just want to highlight that to kind of just put emphasis or as a salient point to identify. But in regards to the interconnectedness, they're all interconnected. We all, like you see, they're all connected in terms of domination, powerlessness, marginalization. That's what connects us together. But it's just important to identify the severity in regards to within that hierarchy of oppression, certain groups are actually at the bottom.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer, Greg. Here's a question about microaggressions, and it's actually a good question because it's not something that we really speak about in terms of, or in the context of providing services, and especially thinking about children and youth who are experiencing persistent mental health issues. So Colette George is writing lots of information. We wish we had more time to get into more details around some of the microaggressions. How do we as service providers address such situations in the moment, especially or particularly with colleagues? Who wants to take it? Joanne, Greg? Yeah.
So I would say that, again, the importance of education would be highly important, as well as advocacy. The reason why I say that is that education obviously provides you with the knowledge and power that you require. And that information relates to whoever it is, make sure that they understand it. And when they understand it, again, engaging in that conversation is very helpful. So in terms of dealing with any form of microaggressions, particularly from colleagues, is the importance of checking in, as well as having trainings that really identify the impacts of racism, but as well, a lot of colleagues as well as staff have seen it on their own hands or have experienced it, and as a result, they may be even perpetuating themselves. So there's that high importance of having the regular trainings, but as well checking in with colleagues if you do have education, knowledge, and power to move them on forward to something that would be more positive in their interactions with either youth or with other colleagues.
Just that, I just want to add something quickly. Joanne's absolutely right. And in regards to identifying that, particularly in colleagues, it's good to look within yourself first, because it's also, because remember, we talk about self-reflection. You have to look at, okay, because with microaggression, it's not, remember, it's very subtle. And it's silent, right? So you don't always see it. So you don't want to also kind of make that assumption. So it's also very good to kind of look within yourself and examine yourself and say, you know what, I felt this invisibility, I felt this dismissiveness, and this sense of feeling invisible, right? And it's in that moment, then you begin to engage in a dialogue. I think it's very important. Rather than impose, we propose, right? And I think that we begin to engage in that kind of conversation about, hey, this is how it felt, but you know, what was going on for you? So engaging those type of conversations is going to be very important in regards to bringing about change. But it's very important to look within yourself first and kind of examine, okay, did I see this? What was going on here for me? And then kind of when you do that, then now begin to engage your colleague with a sense of just dialoguing about the actual instance.
Okay. And there's a very similar question from Mary Lynn Brigley. So I think we may have answered your question, Mary Lynn, but if not, just type it again in the question box so we can come back to it, because it is about microaggression and then how to get folks to acknowledge their role. The next question is, what happens when a counselor or a therapist asks racialized youth about the role that racism may be playing in their experiences, and the youth doesn't recognize it? That's a really good practice question.
In my circumstances, at times you do identify it as being a racism, some level of racism, and the youth may not recognize it. And again, everyone goes through stages. I could say, again, when I was younger, what I thought racism was completely different from now that I'm older. So what I would do is one thing, except for the stage that the youth is at, I wouldn't force information down them. But what I do, again, is provide them with education on what's going on in their community, what they may be experiencing, how that personal is linked to the political, even though they may not acknowledge it that it's happening to them. And again, this doesn't happen in one session. I'm blessed to at least be having youth that are on my caseload that I see on a regular basis or communicate with them either face-to-face or by phone. And these conversations take place naturally. So it's not something that is sort of forced on them or pushed on them. And critical thinking is a skill that you develop over time and is always evolving. So as a worker, initiating conversations like this, not only in that moment, but throughout the process, would be helpful for the youth to understand, probably near down the future, what they're experiencing.
Just to add on that quickly, if when you're engaged in that conversation, you have to think about colonization and decolonization. And that seems like a technical word, but it's colonization is kind of the overarching cultural imperialism, right? The system of domination that creates racism and makes it invisible. When you begin to decolonize, youth aren't engaged in that conversation, right? We've already kind of identified how subtle racism is, and it's kind of being dismissed, right? We don't see race. Racism is not an issue anymore. That was back then. This is now. So you're going to probably see a lot of youth that might not acknowledge it. The key is to recognize it within you first. Okay, do I feel uncomfortable dealing with race? How do I begin to look at that within myself? And then now when you begin to self-implicate, you have to now create a safe place for that youth to now begin to be able to talk about it. So they might not want to talk about it right away because they don't feel that sense of safety. So identify, how do I begin to create safety for the youth and for myself, right? In regards to how do I begin to implicate myself, but also create safety for the youth to have dialogue around that is also going to be very important.
Thank you. And actually, I'm reminded about one of the processes that you spoke about, Greg, involving pain, and that sometimes these discussions, admitting to it and exploring that can be painful. So I guess part of it is also being open to that discussion. And then can you mention how these concepts and reality can be addressed in educational settings? So this question is looking at how do you take these big ideas and make them real for children who are in elementary school, and I'm assuming their families as well.
Although I haven't worked with elementary school age children, I would say there's that privilege of being able to use art and crafts as a way, as well as other forms of illustrations to explain information. So one idea that just came up to mind is being able to use a picture and say, what do you think of this young girl who's probably racialized and looks like them, right? What do you believe her hopes are? how do you believe others perceive her? And again, you would be using as simple language as you can. And from there, you'll be adding in concepts that would help them, again, understand how race, perceptions of others, right, impacts an individual. And you'll be surprised, again, that many of the younger children are often seen as not being able to understand large concepts, but in fact, they're quite in tune. They actually are using technology quite faster than we ever did when we were their age. So I think that it's being able to take that leap of faith and understand that they would understand the concepts and are willing to engage, but you do have to do it possibly in a more intriguing way, right? By pictures, other forms of arts and crafts to illustrate concepts.
Thank you. That's very concrete. And we have a question and comment from our colleagues at Six Nations Mental Health, essentially saying, so knowing that we need to listen, empathize, and validate, and also reflect on ourselves is being advised, and that's good. However, putting that into action and practicing it as a skill, I just lost it. Are you aware of any training related to this specific topic? And I think this is an important question because it always comes back to how do you put these theories into practice. I think that as we learn, but have difficulty putting it into practice, self-reflection and making changes is a huge skill. So essentially, how do you do this?
I guess for me, we talked about implication and identifying your own self-identity. Just for my own understanding of my own racial identity and who I am as a social worker and the privileges that I hold, and how I myself perpetuate and reinforce oppression. I think that's the start. I think really looking within ourselves, or even seeing the impact or trauma of colonization has had on me. Because I mean, look at slavery, look at colonization, look at the plight, right, in terms of the Africana people. And I mean, that's a way for me to begin to kind of engage in a sense of consciousness raising, right, and redefining in regards to who I am. And by doing that, you'll be able to start engaging in this practice. It doesn't start on a system level. It starts with our community, it starts with ourselves, starts with our family, our brothers, our sisters, you know, the people who are closest to us. That's where we start doing this type of conversation and dialogue, and then what will happen is this passion and enthusiasm will now permeate in the people around us. And I think that's where we have to, and that's not taught in school, but I think through suffering, I think we learn a lot of lessons through suffering. I think we look at how suffering is this, oh my gosh, it's so terrible, but I think suffering teaches us. It builds character. It builds perseverance. And I think that's where it starts, is to acknowledge the importance of that. Like I said, the pain is the process. And I think we can start looking at acknowledging and empowering how important that is. Then we're going to begin to start feeling validated and affirmed in regards to doing the self-reflective practice.
Okay. And the folks from DH Work, I'm not 100% clear on your question, so maybe you can clarify in the question box. It looks like you're asking what categories do elementary school kids who don't feel like they look like anyone else, and they're having a hard time, what categories do they fit into? So maybe you can clarify. And while you're clarifying, I'm going to go back to Mary Lynn Brigley, who actually clarified her question. And she's writing, I have a specific question related to microaggression. In my role as a counselor, I am often in situations where I can act as an advocate for youth, and the person in power has microaggressions that are impacting the outcome of the situation. For example, school suspension. What role can I play in that scenario to continue to advocate for and empower or support this young person?
I think that's a really good question. It's something that we do face within our work. I think that it would be very important to identify in a situation like that one who your allies are. Although you are the worker and the person who is demonstrating the microaggression is there, as well as the student, is there anyone else that you can involve in the process of discussing what the student's requirements are within the school and ensure that they get the support they require? There are different wards for the area as well. So I'm sure there's someone within your setting that would be able to provide additional leeway or support to state that your position and the information that you're providing is valid and should be considered for assisting the student in the school.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to just lost where the questions are, okay? Want to say something?
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
Just in regards to that one as well, It's important if you want to empower the youth as well, is to also connect to the powers, right? Connect to those who are in position of power to talk about race and racism and discrimination, right? And and how we produce or reproduce that. Advocate, I think Joanna had mentioned this, get other agencies, other support agencies involved, families, right? Because don't see this as something that you need to do alone. Engage with the families and the communities in this as well, right? In this type of conversation, because I think that's where it starts. I think counseling is not an individualistic thing. You need to see it as a collaborative. So trying to reach out there either to other ethno-racial agencies for support, or reach out to the community or the parents or family and engage them in that process of advocacy in regards to addressing that issue.
Thank you. You guys the participants are really full of questions, good, solid questions today. But we have time for one more. So I'm going to take the next one on the list, which is about internalized racism. So is there any acknowledgement that internalized racism, colorism, classism within the family system is the source of the individual young person's initial experiences of racism? If yes, how do you work with families? And I like this question because it brings families back into the picture and connects children and youth to these other systems that they're really actually engaging with every day. So that's a good question to end on.
Yeah. I guess examining and analyzing that question, when you look at internalized racism, it doesn't start with the individual. Remember, it's always external. The individual takes it into the home, right, as a result of the impact of the system. Because if they already feel socially excluded, and there's a sense of social banishment, right, from the system, right, in regards to access to services, in regards to just accessibility, in regards to feeling a sense of belonging, in regards to like Eurocentrism, right, where you feel like your culture and identity is being dismissed, right, where no one talks about who you are or your race unless it's in a very demonizing, villainizing way, right? So it starts from the society and then it moves into the internalization process where now the family begins to now think that maybe this is who we represent and maybe this is who we are in regards to now I can't take care of my family, I'm not getting any work, my income disparity is low, and then all of a sudden now drinking starts to happen, depression, anxiety, these were all kind of violence and now begins to manifest itself. So I think that's what we need to acknowledge, how the system is perpetuating and how the individual begins to internalize that. I think a big part of that is to create safety for the family and safety to talk about it. But again, before you even begin that process is also how do I begin to implicate? How do I implicate myself when I have friends or colleagues that engage in these type of micro-invalidation and micro-insult, right? That is very subtle. What do I do when I feel that it's discriminatory? Do I talk up? Do I say something? It's important that in those situations you begin to start feeling comfortable within yourself how you perpetuate it, but also how am I combating this? How am I fighting against this? How am I challenging? How am I interrogating this? And then when you begin to start doing that, you are going to feel in a sense more able to connect with the family to understand, right, in regards to some of the plight and some of the experiences, because now you're making the invisible visible. And I think that's very important when you're going to engage with the families and the youth in these type of conversation. You have to make the invisible visible because now it makes it real. It's not an illusion anymore, right? And I think in society it's been told that these things are an illusion, doesn't happen. And what happened is the racialized youth or families then think that it's a pathology. Maybe I'm making this thing up. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm a failure. Maybe I'm just not doing well. Maybe, all right, and it becomes individualized and pathologized. So when they begin to those type of conversations, it's good to understand where that's coming from and then begin to find ways to look for resilience, but also resistance. Right? Look for hidden resilience. Hidden resilience is they might be finding doing negative. You might be smoking marijuana or doing things to cope, but right, they could be robbing a store. Right? They could be ending up killing somebody. So even though marijuana is something that might be seen as deviant, right? It's a hidden resilience. Right? It's still helping them to cope with the situation that they're being dealt with, and it's a way to manage and take back some control. So it's a way to recognize hidden resilience and the meaning behind that.
Okay. And just to add, I'm not sure if I'll be answering your question correctly, but when you mentioned the acknowledgement that internalized racism, colorism, classism within the family system is the source or the primary source of that initial experience of racism, I have seen that or heard the experiences, especially of biracial children, again, feeling as though they don't have a sense of belonging within their own family. Reason being is that they may appear to be darker or lighter than their other siblings and as well the parents being of a different race, they feel as though that one is favored over the other. And I oftentimes do that direct contact with the parents as well as the siblings to have conversations around that. I think that, again, that being able to state what it is and the feelings that is oriented towards feeling especially ostracized by family members is very important, because that's, again, where children as well as youth build their identity on. And if they actually accept those comments made by their family members in such an immediate, close interaction, then actually accepting it in society will be even more easier for them. So again, I would do that direct link to the family members as well as any other siblings who have contact with them and have conversations on how their displays of either racism, classism, and so forth impacts the youth.
Okay, so that's it for the questions. I just want to say thank you so much to both Joanne and Greg for joining us today. It's cold outside, and they managed to get here and help us out with this this webinar today. Also, I want to say thank you for your excellent questions. They were really solid questions and really interesting questions. It's good to see that people are very eager to figure out how do you put this in practice. And just point out that there are some really interesting back and forth happening in the question box where people are connecting with each other to figure out ways to actually put this in practice and provide training. So you can take a look through there. This concludes today's webinar. I just want to give you a heads up that on Monday we are having the first French webinar. You can look at the website www.complexneeds.ca for more information on that webinar, and it'll link you to the French website. And that's specifically looking at children and youth around mental health and addictions, and specifically around gaming. And then on February 5th, webinar series, and that topic will be on gender-independent children. So we're really So tell us what you think. Please take 5 minutes to fill out a short questionnaire of this webinar recording. Your feedback is really important to us in terms of improving and advocating for other training in the future. So all your responses will be kept confidential.